Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation that will focus on how the war changed the lives of Germans. Now let's start with some horrendous statistics. It is thought that about 15 million Germans fought in World War II, of whom as many as 5 million were killed, and between 6 and 7 million were wounded, many hundreds of thousands of whom were permanently disabled. And it is thought that there might have been more than 3 million civilian deaths, more than 300,000 due to Allied bombing, so that in total around 8.2% of the German population died as a result of the war, with much more than that figure wounded or injured. And at this point, may I humbly remind us that history is always about people, and these bold statistics were actually people's lives. Old and young people, and everything in between, and women as well as men. Now at first the war was good for Germany. In the early years of the war, 1939 to 1941, when Nazi Germany met with such astonishing success, the occupied countries were used to provide materials and foodstuffs. They were also forced to hand over money, and all of this, of course, helped. Whilst rationing actually increased supplies for some people, workers in heavy industries such as coal mining, for example, and expectant or nursing mothers. Yet even before the war, preparing for war was the Nazis' priority, and so there was never a strong consumer economy. Now, with war, the consumer economy was of no concern, and there were soon shortages, with rationing introduced for food in late August 1939, actually before the war had even started, and in November for clothes. Though, with conquered countries to plunder, shortages were not at this point critical. But it wouldn't last long, and by the middle of the war, food was really in short supply, and even things like soap. And after 1942 and the switch to a total war economy, well, supplies dropped alarmingly. It was the invasion of Russia in 1941 that proved to be the watershed in every way. Now, as the war approached, the demands on women increased. The Nazis were forced to change their policies with regard to women, encouraging them to return to the workplace in ever greater numbers as the war's needs only increased. They worked in armaments factories or on farms, or as volunteers working for the Red Cross, or else collecting and sorting scrap metal, or acting as air raid wardens. And by the end of the war, 500,000 women were working as auxiliaries in the army. Now I think it's important to also consider the psychological demands placed on women during war. Very often they were also wives and mothers. This meant that they probably had a husband at the front. This also meant that many were left alone to cope with their children and also perhaps aging parents, dealing with rationing and shortages. And all the time they had the worry of not knowing whether their husband would return from the war, or if he did, in what condition. Many would have children who had been evacuated to the countryside, and they would be worrying about them too. Or else for older women, they had sons at the front. The Hitler Youth movement considerably changed in character too, as the need to prepare German youth for war became more urgent. At the time war broke out, all German boys aged 18 were required to complete 6 months in the Reich Labour Service, then 2 years military service. But 21 was the age before most were sent to war. Still, 1 million Hitler youth leaders were immediately called up into the army. Hitler youth boys functioned as air raid wardens and anti-aircraft gun assistants in German cities from the start of the war. And after the failure in Stalingrad in January 1943, with Hitler's army stretched to the limit, the anti-aircraft guns were manned solely by Hitler youth boys. The age for military service would lower as the war went on, and after Stalingrad, boys as young as 17 could officially volunteer. And by 1944, when Allied forces were on German soil, 16-year-olds were being taken, with reports of really young children playing their part. This was the Volkssturm, the People's Army, with 60-year-olds fighting as well. And with the army steadily pushed back after Stalingrad, German civilians as well as their soldiers increasingly suffered. Transport became worse, and at the same time workers were being urged to work longer hours in worsening conditions. Village life also suffered, and in 2 ways, each heading literally in opposite directions. Villagers were obliged to take evacuees from the bombed-out cities, almost 5 million people in total, half of them children, while also being obliged to head into those cities themselves to work in the armaments factories. In those last years of the war, Germany was also subjected to a degree of bombing never before experienced, though it would soon be the same in Japan. The bombing, both day and night from the spring of 1943, did untold damage in cities across Germany, including Berlin. In just one raid on Hamburg in July 1943, it is thought that 30,000 people were killed. In a raid on Dresden in February 1945, as many as 25,000 were killed. Google the pictures. The destruction is quite staggering. We've already noted the civilian casualties, but somewhere between 2 and 3.5 million homes were destroyed too, and around 7.5 million people made homeless. 20 million people were without basic utilities like water and fuel. Now think about what this means. Having lost their homes, Germans could only move into those houses still habitable, which did not necessarily mean they would be considered habitable today. And it certainly meant overcrowding and strained sanitary facilities. The bombing, of course, also meant that roads and railway lines were destroyed, making it harder to transport food. Things like bakeries were destroyed too. This was war brought to the very young, to women and to the elderly. The numbers of refugees increased drastically as the war came to an end. Millions of Germans and ethnic Germans fled or were expelled as the Russians advanced. Their immediate future was one of abject misery. So much so that of 16 million German refugees at the war's end, perhaps something like 2 million of them died of cold, hunger, disease, or sheer exhaustion. And yet worse was to come. for more than 1 million German women, from the very young to the very old, as at the war's end they were raped by Russian soldiers, exacting revenge for what Germany had done to their nation. Such is the utter brutality of war, and such was the impact of war on German women. But the problems of all other Germans, great though they were, pale in comparison to that of German and all European Jews, as the war led to the Nazis' final solution, the Holocaust. However, that's for another presentation. I hope this one has been useful for you. War certainly changed life for Germans. Thank you, as always, for listening. Cheers.